Welcome to the ADHD Open Space Podcast. My name is Gray Miller, and I will be your host and facilitator as we explore ideas, workarounds, accommodations, and other aspects of being a professional adult with ADHD. Most of this will come from my perspective as a cis white male in his mid-50s, living in the Midwest, who found out a year ago that I've been living with ADHD my entire life. I am not an expert on ADHD, except maybe in not knowing I've had it for half a century and somehow still getting by. But I promise to cite my sources, or at least admit when I'm repeating something I read on the interwebs. If I say anything you don't agree with, you're welcome to call me on it and let me know. This podcast is also part of the lead-up into the first ADHD Open Space happening in Madison, Wisconsin on January 20th, 2024. You can learn more about that event both here in the show and at the website adhdopen.space. The first 30 episodes of this podcast are also being released as part of National Podcast Post Month, NaPodPoMo. That means things might get a little rough, but it's going to be fun. Kind of like ADHD, right? Enjoy the show. The dangerously addictive law of mobility. Made for open space, but tempting for the rest of the world. First published on Substack, October 19th, 2023. Here's the thing about open space. Aside from providing people with the opportunity to share the things they're passionate about, it also provides them with an opportunity to be responsible. That one law I mentioned, it's known as the law of mobility, and it is pretty simply expressed. If you are not benefiting from or contributing to whatever is going on in front of you, move somewhere you can. Now note that it's not called the opportunity of mobility or the you might want to of mobility. It is the law. And it's the only law. As I pointed out in the last episode, there's various interpretations of the principles, but the law of mobility applies equally to everyone. Even the person leading the session can use it. I thought this was a good topic for discussion, but I'm not really feeling it anymore. Let's do something else. Now think about it for a moment. What does an entire event run on the law of mobility mean? Well, as a session leader, it means that if people are listening to you, they absolutely want to be there. You're not filler. You're not the least boring speaker at a time slot. You are showing that you care about your subject by virtue of being there talking about it. And the people who are there with you also care, or else they wouldn't be. If someone does leave, that's got to be for one reason only. They have something more important to do. Why would you want to begrudge them that? Take credit for inspiring them to do something they feel passionate about. There's another benefit. The law of mobility does not suffer fools for long. If someone is just going through the motions or regurgitating stale material or speaking from a position of arrogance rather than authenticity, the crowd knows. I have seen groups gather, start listening, and then, bit by bit, fade away. Meanwhile, the person presenting, who's never a novice, is just someone who's used to having a captive audience, grows wild-eyed in desperation. Their material is being held to a higher standard. Rather than relying on titles or reputations or even theatricality, the attendees demand that you be relevant now. I have heard of people who, after attending an open space event, choose to exercise the law of mobility at a traditional convention, much to the consternation of the, quote, vetted presenters. Reportedly, one presenter was so vexed by this pattern that they asked if they could lock the doors after they started their presentation to prevent people from leaving. Thankfully, fire codes prevailed, and that particular presenter was simply forced to level up their game to keep the crowd. The 4 principles are guidelines. They can be malleable. But the law of mobility is essential. It keeps people mindful of what they are doing, what they're saying, and makes sure that the day stays interesting, relevant, and dynamic. Incidentally, Harrison Owen originally called this the law of 2 feet, but I can only imagine that is because he's never had to explain it to someone who is sitting in a wheelchair with only 1 foot, grinning at your awkwardness as you realize the ableism inherent in the system. I did have to do that at an open space in Los Angeles, and I never used that phrase again. So that's the end of the article. I mentioned yesterday that there was an open space that was planned to be this weekend, coming up, actually. And about a week and a half ago, before we had really put any of the concrete things, we had a space, but it wasn't like we were butting anybody out of the space. We had a few registrations, not very many. We hadn't purchased any food, any materials, anything like that. And I realized that I was not really in a place in my work, in my life and things like that, that I could do this particular open space. I realized that it was not going to benefit me, and I was not going to contribute really anything to the people there. I would be literally just going through the motions. Now, when you've done this many open spaces, it is possible to go through the motions. But I realized that there wasn't a reason to do that. And so I did choose to exercise the law of mobility, and I walked away from the event. Now, this is not a normal thing. This is actually the first time I have ever done that. I have had events fall through when I planned them, but it was never me. In this case, it was me. And I'll be honest with you, part of it is in regards to the ADHD. It is in regards to the idea of self-care. It's the fact that I am working to notice when I am doing things because I'm trying to please other people or because I feel like it's expected of me, versus when I'm doing things because I believe in them, because I find them to be important. This particular open space had been originally proposed to me, over a year ago. And then the person who proposed it backed out and it got taken up by someone else. And so it was kind of not very set up to begin with. And I think that, I know that I made the right decision, but it's a hard decision because we're very much conditioned to follow through, make sure you do everything, make sure you do the things you say you're going to do, and, sacrifice the body, accomplish the mission. That's a little Marine Corps stuff for you, since tomorrow also, by the way, is the Marine Corps birthday. But tomorrow, by the time you listen to this, it'll be today. Anyway, all of which makes me go, oh no, if I admit that I did this, people are going to think that if they come to the ADHD open space, January 20th in Madison, Wisconsin, it might get canceled. Well, I can't 100% guarantee it'll happen. I mean, nobody can do that. But I can tell you that the feeling of this particular open space is completely different than the feeling of the other one. And it's not because of the people involved. I don't know who's going to be involved in the new one. And I absolutely love the people that were involved in the last one. But I also love them because I know that they understand how self-care affects things. And I know that they will understand that this was the choice I had to make. So they have, actually. They've already wished me well. And if we ever, do feel it again, we can always come back again. So anyway, at this point, I'm rambling. But hey, it's Nanpod Pomo, and I can ramble if I want to. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed learning about the law of mobility, and I do hope that you integrate it into your life more often. I think the world would be a better place. I also am finally going to acknowledge that we do actually have a sponsor. Now, we do sometimes have little notes in the podcast notes or the posts that I make, encouraging you to either share the post or share the podcast, or if you'd like to support the work, you can subscribe on one of the Substack levels of subscription. But I'm never going to make this particular podcast have a paywall. It's not going to happen. Just not going to do that. So it wouldn't necessarily be a point to doing that. But we also are partnering for the ADHD Open Space with Serendipity Labs, which is a co-working space here in Madison, Wisconsin, and several other cities. And they have partnered with us because they are also interested in finding out what happens when a bunch of professionals with ADHD get together and have an open space. And I just want to acknowledge that I appreciate their help, and I'm really looking forward to January 20th when that happens. Keep those cards and letters coming, folks. I enjoy hearing from you. I enjoy hearing your comments. And we will come back tomorrow with a nightmare of social anxiety. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the ADHD Open Space Podcast. Again, my name is Gray Miller. If you have any comments or questions about the show, you can feel free to leave them on the podcast page at adhdos.substack.com/podcast, or you can email me directly, Gray, Gray, at adhdopen.space. The background music for the intro and outro are from pixabay.com and are called Funny Days Together by Background Music Lab, used under a YouTube Content ID license.